Welcome back to the deep dive. Today we're setting the time machine for the 1850s.
Oh, a fun decade.
Yeah, right. And usually when you picture this era, you think of, I don't know, the gold rush or maybe the transcontinental railroad being built.
Right, big crinoline heap skirts.
Exactly. It feels very romanticized, like this classic manifest destiny vibe.
It does. But today we're looking at the thundercloud hanging over all of that.
Yeah, the really dark stuff.
Exactly. We're digging into some fantastic source material today, a historical masterclass on the political chaos of the decade, notes on the total collapse of a major political party, and the explosive birth of a new one.
We are talking about the specific years, the specific arguments that tore the United States apart, and the sources we have for you today are just incredible.
They really are.
We have breakdowns of the legislative acts, sure, but we also have the raw, verbatim transcript of the third Lincoln-Douglas debate in Jonesboro, Illinois, from September 1858.
Which is an absolute goldmine. I mean, you really can't understand modern American history without understanding the political vacuum of the 1850s.
Right.
It wasn't just a disagreement. It was a fundamental system failure.
Absolutely, a system failure. And our mission for this deep dive is to analyze how the Whig Party, which is a name you probably remember from high school history but might know nothing about, how that party totally disintegrated.
It vanished.
Right. And we're going to look at the birth of the Republican Party from that rubble. And then we are going to zoom in, microscope style, on that debate stage in Jonesboro.
And let me tell you, reading that transcript,
Yeah.
these guys were not polite.
No.
It is a cage match. There are personal insults, there are conspiracy theories about secret backroom deals, and some truly intense rhetoric.
It definitely wasn't some dry policy discussion. It
Yeah.
feels more like a modern Twitter feud, but with much higher stakes and honestly better vocabulary.
Much better vocabulary.
So let's unpack this. We have to start with the old order. Before the Republican Party even existed, you had the Democrats and you had the Whigs.
Right, and the Whigs are fascinating. For a long time, they were the party of business, of infrastructure, and what they called internal improvements.
Think of them as the builders.
Exactly. They were the guys who wanted canals, railroads, strong banking systems.
But politically, the sources describe them as functioning like, I love this phrase, political duct tape.
It's the perfect analogy, just trying to hold the North and South together with sticky tape.
Because they were a coalition held together by basically avoiding the one subject that would destroy them, which was slavery.
Precisely. They were institutionalists. They feared the collapse of the Union more than anything else. So their entire strategy was to compromise, keep the machine running.
And the big compromise that held everything together for decades was back in 1820, right? The Missouri Compromise?
Correct. That drew a literal line on the map, latitude 3630.
Right across the middle.
Yep. North of the line is free territory. South is slave territory. It was a geographic containment strategy.
It allowed politicians to basically say, look, the issue is settled. We have a map. Let's get back to talking about tariffs and canals.
Exactly. It took the heat out of the room.
So what ripped the duct tape off? Because by 1854, everything just falls apart?
The Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854 is the wrecking ball. This is the massive turning point. Stephen A. Douglas, who is known as the Little Giant, a Democrat from Illinois, introduced the concept of popular sovereignty.
Which, on the surface, sounds great to a modern ear. You know, let the people vote. It's very democratic.
That's the branding genius of it.
Yeah.
In theory, it meant letting the settlers in a new territory like Kansas vote on whether to allow slavery or not.
Right.
But think about what that does to the map you just talked about.
It totally erases the line.
Exactly. It effectively repealed the Missouri Compromise. It meant slavery could go anywhere, even into territories previously guaranteed to be free, if the local settlers just voted for it.
And that's why the Northern Whigs freaked out. The deal was completely off.
Right. If you're a Northern Whig, you've been telling your voters back home, don't worry, slavery is safely contained. Suddenly, Douglas comes along and says, actually, the containment is over. It's open season.
And the Whig Party just couldn't straddle that divide anymore.
They really couldn't. Southern Whigs supported the act, while Northern Whigs despised it. The party didn't just lose an election. It evaporated.
It dissolved into a vacuum because it couldn't function as a national entity.
And as we know, nature abhors a vacuum. This is exactly where we see the birth of the Republican Party.
But looking at the notes on the founding, this was in Ripon, Wisconsin in 1854, it wasn't just a group of abolitionists getting together in a room.
No, and that's a very common misconception. It was what historians in our sources call a coalition of frustration.
A coalition of frustration. I like that. So who is actually in the tent?
basically everyone who was angry about the Kansas-Nebraska Act. You had former Whigs who were suddenly politically homeless. You had anti-slavery Democrats who felt totally betrayed by Douglas. And you had a group called the Free Soilers.
The Free Soilers are interesting because their motivation wasn't necessarily moral, right?
Right. Many Free Soilers weren't fighting for racial equality at all. They were fighting for the economic interests of white laborers.
Because they didn't want white farmers to have to compete with slave labor for land and jobs out west.
Exactly. So they wanted the West to be free soil purely for white settlers.
So you have this group of incredibly strange bedfellows. Moral abolitionists, economic free soilers, disgruntled Whigs, all united by one single principle.
Stop the spread, halting the expansion of slavery.
And this is a nuance that the sources really highlight.
It is. The early Republican platform wasn't necessarily demanding the immediate abolition of slavery where it already existed in the South.
Right. They weren't saying ban it everywhere today.
No, they were saying you cannot bring it west. You cannot make it national.
And this brings us to Abraham Lincoln. Now, he didn't start the party.
No, he was actually a former Whig himself. But he became the defining face of this new coalition because he had a very unique way of framing the argument.
How so?
Well, he wasn't a radical firebrand like John Brown, but he brought a moral clarity that the others lacked.
Right. He argued that slavery was fundamentally wrong and must be put on a path to ultimate extinction.
That phrase, ultimate extinction, is crucial. It absolutely terrified the South.
Even though it was a long-term idea?
Even so. Because even if Lincoln said, I won't touch slavery in Alabama today, saying you want to put it on a course for extinction means the clock is ticking. You are telling the South your entire economic system is dying.
So we have the players set up. We have Douglas, the Democrat, the architect of popular sovereignty. We have Lincoln, the rising Republican star, arguing for containment and ultimate extinction.
And it's 1858.
Right. They're running for the Senate in Illinois, and they decide to hold a series of debates.
7 debates in total across the state. And the source material has us zooming in on number 3, Jonesboro, Illinois.
Now, you have to set the scene for us here, because Jonesboro wasn't Chicago.
Far from it. This was an area known as Egypt, the deep southern tip of Illinois. The crowd was about 1,500 people, and most of them were from slaveholding backgrounds or had migrated up from the South.
So this was incredibly hostile territory for Lincoln.
Extremely hostile, and reading the raw transcript, Douglas knows it. He is playing to that crowd so hard. It's actually kind of shocking to read how aggressive he is right out of the gate.
Douglas really is a master debater, and honestly a bit of a bully in this text. He launches this massive 3-pronged attack. First, he goes for a conspiracy theory involving what he calls a bargain.
The bargain. It sounds exactly like modern politics.
It really does. Douglas stands up there and tells this elaborate story that back in 1854, Lincoln and another politician, Lyman Trumbull, made a secret backroom deal.
Right. He claims they agreed to abolitionize the Whig and Democratic parties just to get themselves Senate seats.
He literally calls it a grand scheme. He says they were going to lead their parties bound hand and foot, captives into the abolition camp.
He's trying to paint Lincoln not just as wrong on the issues, but as a schemer.
Huh.
A dirty politician who sold out his old party for personal power. He wants those old Whigs in the audience to feel personally betrayed.
And then he hits him with the flip-flopping charge. He basically calls Lincoln a chameleon.
Right. Douglas argues that the Republican Party changes its color depending on the latitude.
Depends on where they're standing.
Exactly. He says up in northern Illinois, they talk like radical abolitionists. In central Illinois, they are moderate. And down in Jonesboro, they try to sound like old school Whigs. He's telling the crowd, this man is lying to you about who he really is.
But the part that really struck me, and we have to address this because it's a massive part of the text, is the racial rhetoric. Douglas doesn't hold back at all.
He doesn't.
And just a quick note for you listening. We are impartially reporting on the content of these historical transcripts. We obviously aren't endorsing these viewpoints, but it is vital to convey the reality of what was said to understand the history.
Absolutely essential. Because understanding this rhetoric is essential for understanding the fear-mongering of the era. Douglas explicitly says, quote, I hold that this government was made on the white basis for the benefit of white men.
It's just so blatant.
He argues that the signers of the Declaration of Independence had no reference to people of color when they said all men are created equal.
He's just trying to scare the crowd. He's saying Lincoln wants to make everyone equal, and I want to keep this a white man's government.
Exactly. He is deliberately weaponizing the prejudices of that specific audience to paint Lincoln as a radical, existential danger to their social order.
And then, just to add some flavor, he throws in some personal mockery. This trotting comment really made me laugh. It's so incredibly petty.
It is. He talks about a previous debate they had at Ottawa, and he claims Lincoln was so frightened by Douglas's questions that his knees trembled and he had to be carried off the platform and laid up for 7 days.
Which was a complete lie, right?
Total fabrication.
Yeah.
But he says to the crowd, I intend to trot him down to Egypt. Like Lincoln is a horse, or maybe a naughty child. He's trying to make Lincoln look physically weak and pathetic.
So Lincoln has to respond to all of this. He's in a hostile crowd. His opponent has just called him a liar, a conspirator, a racial radical, and physically weak. And Lincoln's rebuttal is surprisingly sassy.
It is very sharp. First, he flatly denies the bargain with Trumbull. He says there is not a word of truth in it. He demands proof. He essentially says, put up or shut up.
And his response to the carried off the stage story is great. He basically says Douglas is delusional.
He does. He points out that he made speeches for 6 days immediately after that debate. He says, I don't know how to explain it other than believing the judge is crazy.
I love that.
He just completely mocks the idea that Douglas is this giant who can just crush him.
But then he pivots to the actual substance. And this is the famous House divided defense. Douglas had attacked Lincoln for saying the government cannot endure half slave and half free. Douglas said, hey, the founders made it divided and it worked fine for decades.
And Lincoln flips that perfectly. He argues that the House was only stable when everyone thought slavery was on the way out.
Ah.
He says the agitation, all the trouble, only started when Douglas and his friends tried to expand it. He says, we had peace under the Missouri Compromise. Why couldn't you leave it alone?
He's blaming Douglas for the chaos. He's essentially saying, you broke the duct tape, not me.
Exactly. He positions the Republicans not as radicals, but as the conservatives, the ones trying to return to the original stability of the founders.
Now, here's where the debate gets really interesting. We get to the legal trap. This is the intellectual core of the debates, and it's a bit tricky, so we really need to walk you through this logic. This involves the Dred Scott decision.
Right. This is the constitutional trap. So remember, Douglas's whole brand is popular sovereignty. Let the people vote.
Okay, got it. Let the settlers decide.
But the Supreme Court had just ruled in the Dred Scott case that Congress cannot ban slavery in the territories because slaves are considered property. And the Constitution protects property.
So wait, if the Constitution says you can't ban slavery, how can the local settlers vote to ban it?
That is the trap Lincoln sets. It's a pure logic puzzle. He asked Douglas, if a settler takes his slave to Kansas, and the Supreme Court says that's his constitutional right, how can the local legislature legally stop him?
That seems like a total checkmate. If Douglas says the people can ban it, he's defying the Supreme Court. But if he says the Supreme Court rules, he admits his whole popular sovereignty idea is a sham.
Exactly. He is boxed in. And Douglas's answer, which becomes known historically as the Freeport Doctrine, is essentially a massive loophole.
What's the loophole? How does he get out of it?
Douglas argues that slavery cannot exist without local police regulations. He says, look, even if you have the theoretical constitutional right to own a slave, if the local people don't want slavery, they just won't pass the laws to protect it.
Wow.
Yeah. He says they won't enforce slave codes, they won't elect sheriffs to catch runaways. So, practically speaking, slavery will just wither on the vine.
So he's saying, technically you have the right, but we're just going to make it practically impossible for you to exercise it.
Precisely. And while that answer saved Douglas in Illinois, it allowed him to tell Northern voters, see, you can still stop slavery locally.
Yeah.
It absolutely destroyed him nationally.
Because the South heard that and said, wait a minute.
Oh, the South heard that and said, you are telling us our constitutional rights could be ignored by a local town council?
Right.
It alienated the Southern Democrats completely.
Yeah.
So Lincoln ended up losing the Senate seat in 1858. But that specific argument split the Democratic Party in half, which paved the way for 1860.
Which brings us to the climax of this whole political drama, the election of 1860.
Right. Because of that split we just talked about, the Democrats completely fracture. The Northern wing backs Douglas, but the Southern wing backs their own candidate.
And this split is what allows Lincoln to win the presidency. He wins with less than 40% of the popular vote and 0 Southern states.
Not a single one. And the reaction is instantaneous.
It's immediate. South Carolina secedes in December 1860, and they cite hostility towards slavery and the election of a president whose opinions are hostile to slavery. They didn't even wait to see what he would do.
The ultimate extinction rhetoric was enough. They saw the writing on the wall.
And I think it is really important to look at the sources here regarding why they left, because people still argue about this today. But we have the Cornerstone speech by Alexander Stephens, who was the vice president of the Confederacy.
It is a chilling document, but historically vital to read. In March 1861, Stephens is explaining the new Confederate government, and he references Thomas Jefferson. Now remember, Jefferson wrote, "All men are created equal," even though he was a slaveholder himself. Jefferson called slavery a necessary evil and hoped it would eventually end.
And Stephens explicitly rejects that, right? And again, just reminding you that we're reporting the exact historical text here, not taking sides or endorsing the views.
Right, Stephens does reject it. He declares that the Confederate government's foundations are laid, its cornerstone rests, upon the great truth that the Negro is not equal to the white man, that slavery is his natural and normal condition.
Wow. There's just no ambiguity there. He is literally saying the American experiment was based on an error, the idea of equality, and they are fixing it.
None at all. He literally calls it the cornerstone. He argues that the American idea of equality was an error and the Confederacy was correcting it. That sets up the ideological conflict perfectly. Lincoln argued we must strive to live up to the ideal Jefferson wrote, even if the founders failed to do so in practice. The Confederacy argued the ideal itself was wrong.
So we go from the collapse of the Whigs to the shouting matches in Jonesboro to the fracture of the Democrats and finally to Fort Sumter, April 1861.
The tragic transition from political crisis to war. Lincoln tries to resupply the fort, the Confederacy fires on it, and as the source notes, declarations are paperwork, cannons are war.
It's so tragic to think about. You really see these dominoes falling, the compromise breaks, the party split, the rhetoric heats up, and then the artillery starts.
It really shows how fragile political stability can be. The Republican Party was born because the existing machinery, the Whigs and the Democrats, just couldn't process the problem of slavery. It required an entirely new vehicle.
And that leads to a really interesting thought about political realignments. The Republican Party was this coalition of frustration Whigs, Democrats, free soilers, outsiders, all united by one single enemy, the expansion of slavery.
Right. They were fundamentally a single-issue coalition at the start.
So what happens when that enemy is gone?
That is the big question. How does a party born from a coalition of strange bedfellows shape its identity when the single issue that united them is resolved?
Right.
That is the exact challenge the party faced after the Civil War ended, and in many ways it's a question that haunts every major political coalition eventually. When the initial glue dissolves, what holds you together?
Something for you to mull over. It's been a heavy deep dive today, but a deeply fascinating one. Thanks for listening, and we'll catch you in the next era.